Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Media Ethics. Here we are again. Again, I'm recording this over the weekend, so I'll be posting this on Monday. So yes, we have more readings to do. We have chapter three, chapter two that we're actually going to talk about today. That's the big one, I would say, because it goes into the depths of where morality and ethics started and who developed them and who is considered to have the higher standards of ethics and morality that's probably applied to media or not. And we're going to basically show what is considered like kind of like a formulaic way of actually developing ethical decisions. And this is all basically outlined in the book. So I'll tell you what, let's go to the shared screen. And here we are. So sorry, let me move some things out of the way. Yes, oops, that's a Wordle from the other day. um, okay. Still a little house cleaning here. So basically, this is actually the teacher view right here. So we're gonna review chapter 2 today, and then chapters 3 and 4 will be the next one. Okay, so remember that we also have a discussion point that and of course basically the it's not just the reading that actually is required, but also, for class participation purposes, the discussion point. And we have a new one. Again, this is the weekend, so I don't have it up. I don't have it posted right at this point, but it'll be one of the students, and I appreciate that, made a good point that I should put a due date on these. So yes, this one will be due February 6th, and that'll be due dates actually listed on the discussion points. Okay. So this one will be basically pick a philosopher and a philosopher from chapter 2. I'm not looking for a thesis or an essay here, just basically a comment. Can anything be applied to what's going on in the media today? Maybe a story you've seen or whatever, and rightly or wrongly, basically. But we'll talk about that. Okay. We'll talk about what these philosophies are. Okay. So basically, it's the study of ethics is chapter 2. And again, the things I point to, especially like I highlight, could be things that actually come up on the midterm exam in March. Okay, so basically, what this chapter does is it basically breaks down. So what I like to say actually is that there's different philosophers. There's actually like basically dead people. Okay, who basically came up with these ideas, but they don't necessarily have to be dead people. Okay, and I know maybe that's a little grotesque, but there's definitely people that like who your Aristotles, your Greeks, whatever, who basically they're your Romans, who basically came up with ideas on their own. What I'm going to do is actually I'm going to just basically come up with my whiteboard here, and what they did was they didn't actually establish morality or ethics or a sort of thing, but it's considered, you could say, basically part of the process. Some of the things they actually decided or came up with or drew from their own studies. And it's interesting because basically what I'll be asking for here is when you actually do your oral presentations, especially, um, I'll be asking like to basically back up your essentially your hypothesis or whatever your belief, your statement on ethics, to back up your case. And one good way to do that is perhaps back up somebody who actually has the expertise and the knowledge, and basically somebody who's actually like studied these matters, not just necessarily media matters, but ethics in general, and apply them, perhaps apply a principle to whatever case you're trying to show is unethical or ethical. Okay. Um, so anyway, so basically that's one way of essentially backing up here. Okay. And yes, okay. So what I'm trying to do up here is call my whiteboard, which I meant to do earlier. Sorry about that. All right, yeah, this is actually somebody else's paper from another class. Okay, let me just get rid of this. It's going very slow, this computer. Okay, all right, there we go. All right, just trying to get rid of this. Oh, wait, okay. Okay, let me just go right here. Okay. All right, so you may remember last week I talked about essentially there's like collaborators, essentially, you could say people who are kind of vested in the decisions of the of what goes into the media and what's reported, essentially. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm actually trying to get a larger font here. Sorry about that. And I mentioned some of the people I've mentioned, essentially design. Okay, boy, this is really slow. I apologize for that. Should have been better prepared. Some of those people, again, like you have essentially your journalists, right? But then you also have your reporters. You have your people who, I'm sorry, you have your people like in medicine. You have people who are environmentalists. Okay, here we go. Journalists. You have maybe people in the scientific community. You have people in government. I mentioned maybe environmentalists, and the list can go on and on and on. What you try to do is you try to like invest as many of these people as possible in the decisions you make and the stories you report. It's not always possible, but you try to do the best you can. But among those people are people essentially who are like academics. I know I didn't spell environmentalists right. So anyway, academics. So basically, like the people we talk about in this chapter could probably fall under that, umbrella of things that are kind of vested in that decision. They're again, like when you're in the editorial boardroom and you're trying to make a decision about what to produce, what to write, whatever, you have again people, different segments of society that are basically vested in it, and what you don't necessarily rely just basically on people who might be essentially partisan to those ideas, but we also try to rely on people who might have like maybe a sort of an objective sort of point of view, or a fly on the wall kind of point of view, or what they call a 10,000 feet view of what's going on. Okay. And a lot of times people will do things like vote academics, people and professors who will comment on things like military maneuvers, they'll comment on things that are happening in government, that sort of thing. People who, a lot of times there's people in academics who might have a liberal bent, so they're not totally like flies on the wall, but they might have like a certain partisan point of view. But they're supposed to be kind of somewhat detached, somewhat studied in this. And these people will fall. These are the people who essentially, again, like I said, will help us determine, which direction we should go in. Okay. And again, they don't necessarily have to be like people from Greek or Roman times, but I've mentioned people along the lines of like, again, not a professor, academic, but Bob Woodward, a reporter who helped break the Watergate scandal and put President Nixon out of office 50 years ago. And he had, again, the saying that is, the reporter should always try to seek the most obtainable version of the truth. So that's basically, I consider another philosophy, not necessarily ancient Greek or Roman, but basically something that can help guide you in your reporting, guide you in your producing, or wherever you put on the screen or on the web or wherever. Okay. So let's go back to this. So let's look at some of the people that are mentioned here. One of the first people is mentioned is Socrates. And what I like to do is I like to try to like take what's said and try to break it down into smaller terms, because it's basically explained in ways that are basically were written a long time ago by people like Socrates and that sort of thing in their 1,000-page essays and that sort of thing. Okay. Socrates, his theory about ethics essentially was that, people should ask, and I highlighted this part, follow-up questions that would expose the inconsistencies and weaknesses in humans' answers. Socrates claims he was not being mean-spirited when he cut arguments down. He said he believed that his continual questioning would eventually lead to basic truth. So what I like to say is that Socrates, the Socratic, basically essentially what they call the Socratic method. He believed in extensive research. Okay. Maybe doing as much due diligence as possible before coming up with an idea or a paper or a principle or an ethic. Okay, that you could apply. So I mean, what could that be for? Well, I mean, that's why the New York Times essentially has the credibility that it has, because when they actually do stories, they're actually like they're not single source. They have like more than one person who's attached to them. If you go down to like maybe like one of their stories here, It's a horrible story here. 7 people killed in an attack in East Jerusalem. I mean, then they won't necessarily just rely on the official reports for that story. Um, I mean, they have essentially like, you know, report released from the court. Just trying to get the whole thing here. They have a video. What else here? There's other stuff here going on. Okay, I'm sorry. There's actually something else here. Actually, I apologize for that. This is the Pelosi attack, actually, if you've heard about that. And basically, like, it goes into more detail about what happened with the Nancy Pelosi's husband and when he was attacked some months ago, back in October. There's apparently a video. So this actually, what this does is it's a good job in going beyond just the police report and providing more substance to the story by providing a video, because there's been a lot of false information that's come out about this that's been really crazy and everything. And I just like, you see some of the stuff that's printed on social media, you just say to yourself, you just shake your head. You've got a judge, you've got other people, maybe even attorneys mentioned here, that sort of thing. So the New York Times does a good job, essentially, like, kind of being really thorough with the story, and that's why it has the reputation it has. So, all right. So let's go to maybe the next philosopher of virtue and the Greeks, Plato. He argued a lengthy dialogue in the Republic. Now, his feeling was actually like a lot of the things that actually come out of the media are essentially based on impulse, and I think his idea was that you know that certain things actually should be that there's human instincts involved in decision making, that maybe again the stuff that you're raised with and that sort of thing, and that should be like considered a value judgment. That's not something I would necessarily go with. Okay, I'm not necessarily going to agree with like what's mentioned in here, but it says Plato argued in a lengthy dialogue called the New Republic that people are composed of 3 temperaments. One consists in the base drives that cause people to seek food, sex, and other creature comforts. Yes, it says that. Second is assertive nature that drives them to defend themselves. And the third is reason. And the reason is actually supposed to be some sort of an animalistic instinct that you use to drive basically your decision making. And hopefully that you have like that kind of like, you're brought up and you're well read enough and you're well studied enough to actually have reasonable judgment in the things you make. So that's actually kind of a judgment that's based on trust, but we don't always see that's being done. Okay. Aristotle had the golden mean. Aristotle contended that the right course of action always lies between 2 extremes. So basically, he's basically saying is that we see it right now in our reporting right now. It's actually I see this a lot in the this come up a lot in the when we do our oral presentations. I've had people do story or oral presentations on the 24-hour news media, because what we're seeing essentially now is like the 2 extremes in media. Okay, we're seeing basically like the the Republican Fox News versus the Democrat MSNBC. But now this could be argued either way, I would say. But one of the arguments that's made that maybe news news production now is not as good as it was like 50 years ago when there were only like 3 networks and that sort of thing, is because the reporting was straighter. It was actually like it was no partisan take on things. And I misspelled the man's name. That sort of thing. And I mean, it's interesting to say this. I mean, how could you be partisan of Martin Luther King's death? But there was actually he was actually, and I don't agree with this at all. Okay, but people actually consider, if you listen to my father, he was actually he was viewed very divisively by a bunch of people, not rightly, but but Walter Cronkite was one of the 3 anchors on television of the day, and basically, if you wanted news via television, national news, you went to 3 people, 3 different networks: ABC, NBC, CBS. He was CBS, and what he would do is he would report the news as straight as possible. Didn't carry a lot of adjectives or anything like that. He basically trusted their viewer to know that that basically you were going that you were going to make the right judgment. And I guess maybe there's a little bit of Plato involved in that too, but that he was going to give it to you, but he was not going to provide that judgment for you. So it's in between the 2 extremes of politics. So let's like watch a little bit what he says here and how basically straight he reports.
Marcus Rhyme and Marcus
Let's watch a little bit of the advertisement.
For all your goals, both big and small, there's better.
Martin with Walter Cronkite, Bernard Calvin, Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of his second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In a friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police who have been...
I apologize for that. It's very descriptive. I mean, it's almost too descriptive. Also, the word that they used to describe the African-American community, I mean, this was the term they used at the time. I'm not saying I was right either, but so, you know, this report was, I'm not excusing it, but this report is 55 years old.
Keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. Police
see, I mean, it's a horrible, tragic event, but you can see that there's not. I'm actually trying to find like another thing that's maybe the opposite of that. You can see that it's still very straightforward reporting. You know, then you look at like Fox News and you see that like, you know, Donald Trump, President Obama is an unbelievable divider. I mean, this is basically like he's on a prime time. This is the kind of things that they come up with, you know, and it's not just Fox News, okay, but you know, the MSNBC is very liberal politically. So, but I mean, basically, you know, this is 7 years ago. This is actually, I guess, when Trump was running, but you can see that this is basically what's passes for news nowadays. So this, you could argue, is not necessarily like would follow the Aristotle's golden mean, okay? But the Cronkite report was very straightforward. I mean, obviously, it's a horrible, tragic event, but he gave you the news as it was, okay? Okay, let's go back to where I was. Okay, so social contract and Hobbes. Hey, Thomas Hobbes, okay? So what he basically was talking about was that people have essentially like a contract with, so it's not all like one thing or the other. It's no opposite, like he said, she said, in terms of these philosophies. It's almost like there's like a slice of like applying a different perspective on it, okay? So what he's trying to say basically in his writing essentially is that so he talks really about audience, okay? And what matters with your audience, what's your contract with your audience, okay? What does your audience expect, okay? Out of that, and basically that could essentially provide, you know, some ethical morality there too, because, but that's interesting because that would differ from what Aristotle would say, because Fox is expected to have a conservative audience. When they have actually taken, like, for instance, when they a lot of people got really pissed off at them when they declared Arizona for Biden in the 2020 election, because they felt like they were, you know, going to take more of a conservative, with a capital C, I guess, political approach, meaning that they would kind of give like Trump more of the benefit of the doubt, you know, maybe not necessarily, you know, there's been a lot of question about from certain people about like the way elections have been handled. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, okay, but I think a lot of it's wrong, but basically, like, you know, they actually fired the guy afterwards. So they felt like they kind of broke a certain contract that they have with their audience. So maybe you could argue that what Fox News does is ethical because they have a certain contract with their audience, and there are so many different choices out there now for media, you know, for people and their audience to choose from. So, you know, you don't necessarily you know, you if you go with like the reasonable judgment, should be able to find news that's as true as possible. Okay. But there is a feeling out there, and I remember I thought about this with my father, that that he felt like the media, when it was actually a lot smaller and there weren't a lot more choices out there, he felt that there was it violated his contract because he felt it was a little bit too eligible. And you could probably possibly make that argument that it was a little bit too favorable to certain candidates, and that they did need to actually report about stories that maybe like weren't always reported. You know, maybe like there were some conservative triumphs out there. And I remember him saying one time when they were going after Clinton back in the 90s about like some of the things he was doing. I remember him saying, yelling at the TV, saying, "It's about time they went after him. About time they didn't go after one of us." So that's like the certain contract that, you know, that maybe a place like this had. Maybe there's a place for a Fox News to exist. Okay. Okay. John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. A general principle of utilitarianism is that everyone should try and act in a good way that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That's basically talking about essentially like good intentions, I would say. That allows, that's maybe a philosophy that allows for errors. You know, categorical imperative is similar. Okay. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, meant, you know, people should make ethical decisions after they're creating laws and rules for everyone to follow. Alfred examples how they should apply in ethics. You know, what else did he say here? He basically said that like people should basically be able to trust the judgment, trust their own judgment, because these are people's jobs, and to come up with ethics and morality and reporting. And basically, you know, and every once in a while they may just like slip up because they're human, and that's what people do. And there's just nothing wrong with that. Just basically like, you know, continue to, you know, just there's actually a Supreme Court decision from 1964 that basically allowed for that to happen, because before 1964 people would make like mess up in decisions, mess up in reporting, and make mistakes, and they could get sued for it big time. But you know, we're all human here, so you know, we can't necessarily like, you know, is that really like a really appropriate standard for reporters to live by, to be right every single time? You know, there should be allowed like opportunity to be allowed for human error. So as long as the intentions are good, that's what basically they're, you know, they're saying that basically, you know, if they have malicious intentions, and if they have reckless intentions, then you should not necessarily trust them, or that sort of thing. Okay. All right, I have this in the actually, as you, again, if you've been following the modules, I actually have this in the modules. In the modules, as you can see in the study of ethics, I actually have a copy of this. And this is actually something that's going to be very important to know. It's called the Potter's Box. Okay. And if you could just give me a second here. So what the Potter's Box does is it essentially comes up with some sort of formulaic decision, basically a formulaic way to come to a decision, where we take all those principles that we applied before, and maybe other principles too, and apply them to essentially like, you know, our decision making. And what it does is it allows like, you know, different ways of actually kind of compartmentalizing the decision, so you just don't have to rely on one source. You know, you want to, it encourages kind of like the Socratic method, research, going to different people, not just dead philosophers, but other people too, to help make a decision. And in our case, an ethical media decision. Okay. All right. So basically there it is right there. So it starts with your empirical definition, which basically is, it basically, that means it essentially identifies the problem. Okay. So if we have a problem, like let's say like we have this decision that we're making about the Firestone tires that we talked about last week. And you know, it's not always a typical decision to actually like, you know, not always a typical way to actually just take a few people's comments and just basically you know, say like, oh, my tire blew out, and basically and trust them necessarily, and you know, think you're going to get some sort of a big story out of it. But that was the ethical decision they had to make. That is, do we go with this? Do we go with this and make this a bigger story? Should we go out and get more research? Should we go out and interview more people, more experts, that sort of thing? No, they actually decided to go with the decision they decided to go with. And the reason for they decided to go with it was that they decided to get those people whose tires blew out and got hurt and got in car accidents and everything, because they knew they trusted those people, and else they knew that it would lead to more stories that like this, many more stories, which is what it did. Okay. So when you go through this process, and I'll go through how it's described in the chapter too, but then it goes to this thing called identify values. Okay. So again, this is under study of ethics in the modules, just so you know. Identify values. So what does that mean? That means essentially the personal values I was talking. I like to call that the gut check component of ethical decision making, where you basically use that. It's not the philosophers you realize, it's not the academics, it's not the Bob Woodwards of the world, but basically how you personally, your personal reasoning, how you were raised, that sort of thing. That definitely your gut check, that definitely has to go in your, even your impulses basically has to factor into the decision. You shouldn't just all rely on like what other people say to make a decision. You have to know what makes you feel comfortable in making a decision. Okay. Appeal to ethical principles, that's the dead philosophers we're talking about. That's when we can kind of search for different people who can essentially apply to this decision making. And like I said, this is again another formula that's also been used in our oral presentation. So make note of this, okay? So when in the Firestone case, where they basically took the people's comments and basically used their judgment. I mean, what dead philosopher, sorry, would we have used in that particular case to make a decision? Well, actually, I mean, there could be a couple of people involved in that. Okay. I actually think with, it, basically Hobbes in a social contract, sorry, not, would probably apply because that TV audience trusts that station, maybe, and they did. That station has had a reputation for doing a good job in coming up with good reporting, and that they were going to do it again, even if it did seem a little flimsy on the surface. That they knew there was something good was going to come out of it because the station has done well for them before. So basically, I would think maybe Hobbes is maybe an ethical principle that you could apply to this. Okay. And I would also have to think that maybe like Plato and reason would also, a third is reason. Basically, like you almost have to like go on like a certain trust. Are these people like credible enough to like basically report on? You basically can also do like a, not necessarily a background check, but look up these people to see if they're actually serious people. Maybe interview people who know these people, just so you know that you're not necessarily dealing with people who make up stuff. Okay. So there's two ethical principles you could apply to right there to help make the decision in favor of the Firestone case. Okay. Now let's go back to this, and then choose loyalties. Well, this is basically where you have to decide, like, is there any kind of like sort of like conflict of interest involved in your decision making? I mean, are you involved? Are you on a side? Do you work for Firestone? What's your loyalty? Your loyalty, this is the easiest part of this Potter's Box. Your loyalty is always going to be the audience. So you have to make a decision. You always have to think about what's my audience expect. And then if there's anything they expect more than anything out of the media, it's truth. Okay. So if they fail any of those tests where you can't come up with like anything to basically come up with these boxes, then basically your decision fails. But in this case, I would say like we had an ethical principle. My personal values are that sometimes if you have like credible people that come up with like a case like blown out tires, you go with it. Okay. The loyalty is the audience are important, and basically their safety and that sort of thing. And then I would say that their decision was right in going with the reporting they did. And look what happened. It led to 60 Minutes coming up with an even bigger report about their deadly scandal.
The year 2000 was shaping up to be a banner year for the Ford Motor Company. Profits were up, way up, thanks to sales of the Explorer, the best-selling SUV ever. It accounts for 20% of Ford's annual profits. Then 2 months ago, boom, all hell broke loose. Word went out that the Explorer was linked to serious accidents, now totaling 101 deaths.
Right, and that was also linked to the tires, from what I understand. So, then there's like examples where you can show like where like there's bad ethical decisions that are come into play. Okay, I always think about this case involving this reporter by the name of Jason Blair, who was a reporter who basically was basically given carte blanche to report on whatever he wanted. And basically, like very little about his reporting was ever checked or reviewed, other than maybe like grammar mistakes. And what he did is he covered the Iraq War 20 years ago. He didn't cover a lot of other things, and he made up stuff. He literally made up stuff. Okay, from his apartment in Brooklyn or something. He said he went out and he interviewed people. I think it was in like Virginia, and he interviewed like a war vet. And he said there were tobacco fields growing in. But one of the things that like the editor should have caught was that tobacco fields don't grow on mountains. I mean, you expect people like, tobacco grows on flatlands. You expect like people who work for the New York Times to actually like have a lot of knowledge in these things, okay? There's like a certain social contract you have expecting the New York Times to actually do good. This actually goes against what I was saying before, right? But this was 20 years ago, and they had to clean up their act. But basically, this was not just a simple mistake, but and Jason Blair shouldn't have been just to blame for this because he allowed he did it because he could. And that doesn't make it right. But there should have been people who actually should have been really checking his reporting, knowing that he knew what he was doing, and really checking on what he was doing to make sure that it was right, and they weren't. So, and then what happened was the San Antonio Express saw that they were being plagiarized by him, and they blew the whistle on him. Okay, when you go through the Potter's box and everything, again, like there's different things you could look for, and I got point to the social contract with Hobbes. Your audience expects the truth, and that also goes to the choose the loyalties part of it too. The audience expects the truth. Right there was like two examples, two boxes where you could show where the New York Times failed and basically made an unethical decision in letting this reporter run wild because they basically didn't check for the truth. They didn't do their research. That's the Socratic method. You can go back and point to Socrates there that they didn't they really should check all that. That's what we do actually at Best Review is actually we actually check titles, we check names. The internet, you can do this so much easier now. Then they had the internet too, but now it's much easier to use. And now you can see basically all the stuff there. The Times published a 2-page accounting misrepresentations of plagiarism by Jason Blair, blah, blah, blah. This article was among those described, okay? And they actually showed had an article, basically they had a bunch of where they showed a bunch of articles written by him where he just failed and failed and failed over again. And New York Times failed and failed and failed over again. And again, it's not necessarily the philosophers you have to rely on to come up with to back up your point, basically with ethical principles. The American Journalism Review wrote a thing called the Jason Blair affair. Okay. And they made the point right here. There's no denying that New York Times has done splendid journalism in his 21 months in his 21-month tenure. His performance after September 11th is non-parallel. His coverage of the war in Iraq. I like to say that it's actually good that when you make an argument, it's good to kind of maybe show the right side, but show what state the problem, but then just try to explain your way out of it, why it was a bad thing. Okay. Or you show basically what could have been done, and then you try show this was the complete opposite. Okay. So basically this this shows that he harnessed a much more inclusive, much less top-down management style and a more open attitude toward its audience. Basically, there was a much less top-down stuff, meaning there wasn't a lot of oversight going on what he was doing, and he was allowed to run free in what he was doing. Okay. Many on the right have claimed that basically there were editors were fired over it. The whole thing. National editor and New Washington Bureau hadn't been told of Blair's pothole-strewn track record, so no alarm bells went off, and serious questions were raised about 2 of her sniper scoops. Basically, he wrote about a sniper who was in Maryland, I believe, and then it turned out that he actually had falsehoods in that too. But apparently, no, he was making these mistakes, and they weren't alert. The right hand wasn't talking to the left hand and letting people know that he was doing this. So, so there's another example where things just went wrong. Okay. So let's go back to that part. Okay. So who came up with this Potter's box? Okay, so basically you have, we'll look at one called Potter's box, named for Harvard Divinity School professor Ralph Potter. Potter suggests that ethical decision-making should go through 4 integrated stages, and there it is again. It's right there in the book. Okay, the first step in the Potter's box again is to define the problem. Okay, suppose a student accuses a professor of sexual misconduct and asks editors of the campus newspaper to write a story before they make a decision. Need more information. So basically, you seek out the information. The second step is identify the values of play. So again, your personal and your professional values that you take to heart should apply to that decision, as I mentioned before. Then the next step is actually the ethical viewpoints, as I mentioned, and they mentioned a few examples right here of the different philosophers that apply to this, the different loyalties, and finally a final decision is made. Okay. All right, so that is chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4 was what I'm going to talk about next. Don't forget our discussion point is that you really need to write and respond to that because that is actually, basically, how we like again gauge class participation. It is essentially homework. So, I mean, you're all adults and everything. I shouldn't have to check up on that all the time, but you should be doing it. Okay. Not everybody contributed the first 2. So please do that. Okay. And that's it, everybody. So let me know if you have any questions, and thanks very much.